dust swirled around the wooden platform of Bitter Creek Station, choking the last ounce of hope from Alice Abernathy's lungs. She stood shivering in her worn gingham dress, clutching a tattered carpet bag, while the man who had promised her forever looked at her with pure disgust. "You ain't the delicate flower in the photograph," Silas spat, tossing her bundled letters into the mud before turning his back on her. Stranded in the unforgiving Colorado territory, penniless and publicly shamed, she braced for ruin. Then a shadow fell over her. A towering mountain man stepped from the saloon's awning. "My twins need someone exactly like you." The Kansas Pacific Railway had promised a journey toward a new beginning, but all it delivered was a rattling, bone-bruising passage into a sun-baked purgatory. Alice Abernathy stepped down from the iron beast, her boots sinking immediately into the loose red dirt of Bitter Creek, Colorado. It was 1874. She was 24 years old, entirely alone in the world, and entirely dependent on the word of a man she had never met. Alice clutched her carpetbag to her chest like a shield. Inside were her meager possessions: a Bible belonging to a late mother, 2 spare aprons, a tin of sewing needles, and a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Those letters were her lifeline. For 8 months, she had corresponded with Silas Montgomery, a man who claimed to own a sprawling cattle ranch just south of the San Juan Mountains. His letters had been poetic, filled with promises of a sturdy home, green pastures, and a life far away from the cholera-ravaged streets of Saint-Ay, Louis that had taken her entire family. She waited by the station master's office, trying to ignore the stars of the locals. Bitter Creek was a rough-hewn town, a chaotic assembly of false-front saloons, a mercantile and a livery stable, all clinging to the edge of the wilderness. Miners covered in gray dust and cowboys smelling of unwashed wool and horse sweat moved past her. Alice straightened her spine, pulling her shawl tighter despite the stifling afternoon heat. She was a practical woman. She knew she wasn't a great beauty. A childhood encounter with a shattered loom in the St. Louis textile mill had left a faint but jagged white scar across her left cheekbone, and years of hard labor had calloused her hands. But Silas had written that he wanted a resilient woman, a true partner. An hour passed, then 2. The station master, a balding man named Arlo, finally stepped out, chewing on a matchstick. "You're waiting on someone, miss. Train's long gone, and the next stagecoach ain't till Tuesday." "Mr. Silas Montgomery," Alice said, her voice steady despite the rising panic in her throat. "He is expecting me." Arlo's eyebrows shot up. "Montgomery? Well, you don't say." He pointed a greasy finger towards the end of the street. "That's him coming now. Best of luck to you, miss." Alice smoothed her skirts and pinched her cheeks to bring some color to them. A polished black buggy pulled by 2 matching bays trotted up to the station. A man stepped down. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored wool suit that looked entirely out of place in the dirt of Bitter Creek. He was handsome, with slicked-back dark hair and a neatly trimmed mustache, but his eyes were hard and calculating as they swept over the platform and landed on Alice. "Are you Alice Abernathy?" he asked, his tone clipped, devoid of the warmth that had filled his letters. "I am," Alice said, taking a hopeful step forward. "Mr. Montgomery, it is a relief to finally meet you." Silas did not offer his hand. Instead, he looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the faded fabric of her dress, her scuffed boots, and finally the scar on her cheek. His lip curled in a snare. "You're a liar," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet platform. Heads turned. A few cowboys loitering by the telegraph office stopped their murmuring to watch. Alice recoiled, the color draining from her face. "I beg your pardon, the photograph you sent," Silas snapped, pulling a small tintype from his breast pocket and holding it up. "This woman is flawless, delicate. You look like a field hand and you have a ruined face." "That photograph was taken before the mill accident," Alice said, her voice trembling but defensive. "I wrote to you about it, Silas. I explained everything in my 4th letter." "I don't read the ramblings of desperate spinsters," he retorted, his voice rising, ensuring an audience. "I agreed to pay for the passage of a beautiful bride, an asset to my estate, not a damaged charity case from a St. Need." "Louis Slum, I'm not a charity case," Alice shot back, her pride flaring. Clears throat, and the hard worker. "You said you needed a partner." "I need a wife fit for high society in Denver," Silas interrupted coldly. I run a prominent lumber and cattle syndicate. What would my associates think if I paraded a scarred seamstress into my parlor? He reached into his coat, pulled out the bundle of letters she had written him, and threw them at her feet. They scattered in the dust. The arrangement is void. Consider your train fare a loss on my part, and your presence a nuisance. Do not seek me out. He turned on his heel, climbed back into his polished buggy, and snapped the reins. The horses lurched forward, ticking up a cloud of red dust that washed over Alice, stinging her eyes and toting her dress. She stood frozen. The humiliation burned through her veins like acid. She could hear the quiet, piting murmurs of the town's people. She had exactly 42 cents in her pocket. She had no family to write to, nowhere to return to, and no means to survive in a territory famous for chewing up the vulnerable. The vast, jagged peaks of the Rockies loomed in the distance, suddenly feeling less like a majestic frontier and more like a prison war. Alice dropped to her knees in the dirt, her trembling hands reaching out to gather her scattered letters. A tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean track through the dust on her face. She had risked everything for a lie. Leave the letters. They're dead words anyway. The voice was a deep, resonant rumble like boulders grinding together at the bottom of a riverbed. Alice gasped and looked up. The sun was blocked by the sheer mass of the man standing over her. He was a giant, standing easily 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block out the station awning. He wore worn, fringed buckskin pants tucked into knee-high leather boots and a heavy wool coat over a simple homespun shirt. A dark, thick beard obscured the lower half of his face, but his eyes, a striking, piercing icy blue, were locked onto hers. A Winchester rifle was slung casually over his back, and a formidable hunting knife rested at his hip. He looked like the wild mountains made flesh. Alice scrambled to her feet, instinctively taking a step back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't need charity," she managed to say, lifting her chin to project a bravery she did not feel. The mud let out a short, gruff huff that might have been a laugh. "Good, because I ain't offering any." He stepped forward, and the crowd of gawkers that had been watching Alice's humiliation suddenly found reasons to look away and scatter. Even the station master retreated into his office, shutting the door. This man commanded a terrifying sort of respect. "Name's Josiah Coloulton," he said, his voice softening just a fraction, though it remained growly. "Folks around here call me Huck. I own a timber claim and a homestead up on Whispering Ridge." He jerked a massive thumb over his shoulder, towards the imposing dark green peaks in the distance. Alice clutched her carpetbag, unsure of what this giant wanted. "I am Alice Abernathy, or at least I was supposed to be Silas Montgomery." She swallowed the bitter lump in her throat. Josiah lived down the road where Silas's buggy had disappeared. A dark, dangerous shadow passed over his icy eyes. "Montgomery is a snake. You're lucky he showed his fangs before you let him bite. He's got a reputation for breaking things he can't control. That brings me little comfort, Mr. Coloulton," Alice said, her practical nature reasserting itself over her grief. "I am stranded in a town I do not know, without a penny to my name, and clear's throat nowhere to sleep tonight." Josiah looked at her intently. He took in the faded dress, the sturdy but scuffed boots, the calloused hands gripping the bag, and finally the scar on her cheek. Unlike Silas, he didn't flinch or look away with disgust. He studied it like a man assessing the grain of a strong piece of oak. "I have 2 children," Josiah stated abruptly. "Twins, Caleb and Cora. They're 6 years old. Their mother, my Sarah, passed of the winter fever over a year ago." Alice blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift in conversation. I am sorry for your loss, sir, but I failed to see. Since Sarah died, I've been trying to keep the claim running and raise them. But the mountain is a hard place. I'm out logging or hunting from dawn till dusk. The twins are running wild. They need schooling. They need hot meals. They need someone who won't break at the first sign of a hard frost. Josiah took a step closer. "I was down here at the Mercantile buying winter provisions when I saw what happened. I saw how you didn't beg that wealthy coward. I saw the calluses on your hands. My twins need someone exactly like you." Alice's breath hitched. "You were looking for a housekeeper." "I'm looking for a wife," Josiah corrected, his voice flat, completely devoid of romantic pretense. "It ain't safe for a single woman to live in a mountain man's cabin out of wedlock. The town would talk, and the men out here would see you as fair game." I can offer you my name, a roof over your head, protection, and a share of whatever the land yields. In exchange, you raise my children, keep the hearth, and stand by my side. It's a partnership, Miss Abernathy. Nothing more, nothing less." Alice stared at him. It was a staggering proposition. She had spent the last 8 months dreaming of romance, of a man who would love her despite her flaws, of a gentle life on a prosperous ranch. Now a wild-looking young stranger was offering her a grueling life of isolation on a freezing mountain, framed purely as a business transaction. She looked around Bitter Creek. The saloon doors swung open, and the raucous laughter of drunken miners spilled out into the street. If she stayed here, she would be destitute by nightfall. The brothel or the freezing streets were her only alternatives. She looked back at Josiah Coloulton. There was no warmth in his eyes, but there was a fierce, undeniable honesty. He wasn't lying to her. He was offering a lifeline, however thorny it might be. "I have conditions," Alice said, her voice remarkably steady. Josiah's thick eyebrows rose in surprise, and a glint of respect flashed in his blue eyes. "Nan, I expect a legal marriage ceremony by a judge before we leave this town. I will not be a kept woman. I expect a separate bed, and I expect to be treated with respect, not as an indentured servant." Josiah nodded slowly. "Judge Tucker is at the courthouse down the street. We'll go now. As for the rest, you have my word. I don't lay a hand on a woman unless invited, and I don't tolerate disrespect in my home." 10 minutes later, Alice found herself standing in a dim, dusty magistrate's office. Judge Amos Tucker, a portly man with a permanent smell of whiskey on his breath, rushed through the bows, clearly intimidated by Josiah's looming presence. There were no rings. There was no kiss. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Josiah simply turned, picked up Alice's carpet bag as if it weighed nothing, and said, "Let's go home, Mrs. Coloulton." They walked to the livery, where Josiah had a massive draft crosshorse saddled and waiting, hitched to a sturdy supply wagon loaded with flour, salt, ammunition, and tools. Josiah effortlessly lifted Alice onto the wagon seat, his large hands lingering for only a second on her waist before he climbed up beside her. As they drove out of Bitter Creek, leaving the dusty town and the humiliating ghost of Silas Montgomery behind, the trail immediately began to incline. They were heading into the wilderness toward the jagged snow-capped peaks that pierced the sky. Alice wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, the reality of what she had just done sinking in. She was legally bound to a giant she knew nothing about, heading into a wild frontier to raise children who belonged to a dead woman. The journey up to Whispering Ridge was a grueling 4-hour ascent that tested Alice's nerves and the suspension of the wagon. The dirt road quickly narrowed into a rocky, rutted trail that clung perilously to the side of a deep gorge. Below them a river churned with white water fury, cutting through the granite. Above them, towering ponderosa pines blotted out the late afternoon sun, casting the trail into an eerie, cool twilight. Josiah drove the heavy wagon with a quiet, masterful ease. He spoke very little, only clicking his tongue to guide the massive horse Goliath over treacherous washouts. Alice sat rigidly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes wide as the temperature dropped steadily. The heat of the valley was gone, replaced by the crisp, biting chill of high altitude. "Almost there," Josiah rumbled, noticing her shivering. He reached behind the seat with one hand, pulled a heavy fur-lined buffalo robe from the supplies, and tossed it over her lap. The gesture was absent-minded, but the warmth was immediate and deeply comforting. "Thank you," Alice murmured. "Don't thank me." "Lead you alive to cook supper," he replied dryly. Alice bristled slightly, but she caught a faint glimmer of amusement in his profile. He was testing her. "I assure you, Mr. Coloulton, I am hardier than I look, though I cannot promise a gourmet meal on my first night. Darn, when I don't even know where your skillets are. Huck. Call me Huck. Mr. Coloulton sounds like my father, and he was a bastard." "Huck." Then Alice conceded, testing the name on her tongue. The trees finally broke, revealing a high-altitude clearing nestled into the shoulder of the mountain. Alice gasped. It was starkly beautiful, but entirely isolated. A sturdy, hand-hewn log cabin sat against a backdrop of sheer granite cliff, protected from the worst of the northern winds. A plume of gray smoke drifted from a stone chimney. A smaller outbuilding, a barn or woodshed, stood nearby, along with a corral housing a milk cow and a mule. But it was the state of the homestead that caught Alice's practical eye. The porch was cluttered with animal traps, rusted tools, and half-chopped wood. The windows were grimy. It looked exactly like what it was: the den of a grieving man focused on survival, not a home. Josiah pulled the wagon to a halt and tied off the res. Before he even stepped down, the heavy wooden door of the cabin creaked open. Two small faces peered out from the shadows. They were identical, with mops of unruly, shoulder-length black hair and striking blue eyes, Josiah's eyes. They wore oversized, dirt-stained flannel shirts and rough trousers. They looked feral, like two wolf pups defending their den. "Caleb, Cora, come out here," Josiah called out, his voice firm but carrying an undercurrent of deep affection. The twins hesitated, then stepped onto the porch. They didn't look at their father. Their hostile glares were locked entirely on Alice. Alice climbed down from the wagon on her own, ignoring Josiah's outstretched hand. She walked towards the porch, stopping a few feet away, dropping to a crouch so she was at eye level with the children. "Hello," Alice said softly, keeping her voice even and calm. "I am Alice." "You ain't our ma," the boy Caleb spat instantly. His small fists were clenched at his sides. "No, I am not," Alice agreed readily, not flinching at his venom. "Your mother was Sarah, and from what I understand, she was deeply loved. I am not here to replace her. I am here to help your father run this house, to teach you your letters, and to make sure you don't eat dirt for dinner." "None." Cora, the little girl, narrowed her eyes. P said he wasn't never going to bring another woman up the mountain. Alice stood up and looked back at Josiah, raising an eyebrow. Josiah ran a massive hand through his dark hair, looking suddenly uncomfortable. "Things change, little bird," Josiah said to his daughter, stepping up onto the porch and ruffling her dirty hair. "Alice is going to be staying with us. She's my wife now. You will treat her with respect. Understand?" "She's too skinny," Caleb muttered, though he backed away from his father's stern tone. "She'll run off when the first snow hits." "They all run off." Alice filed that piece of information away. "They all run off. Had there been others?" She didn't ask. Instead, she picked up her carpet bag and walked past the children into the cabin. The interior was dim, lit only by the fire in the large stone hearth and the fading light from the windows. The air smelled strongly of old wood smoke, curing leather, and unwashed wool. The furniture was massive and handmade. In the center of the room was a heavy oak table covered in maps, hunting gear, and dirty tin plates. A steep ladder led up to a sleeping loft where Alice assumed the children slept. In the back corner, separated by a heavy canvas curtain, was the master bed. "It's sturdy," Alice said, trying to find a compliment. "It's a mess," Josiah corrected, walking in with a crate of supplies on his shoulder. "I told you I've been working the timber lines. Haven't had time for scrubbing." Alice took off her shawl and hung it on a peg by the door. She rolled up the sleeves of her gingham dress. The fear and exhaustion of the day were threatening to overwhelm her, but she knew that if she sat down now she might shatter. Work was her armor. "Where is your water bucket?" she asked. Josiah pointed to a wooden bucket near the door. "Spring is 50 yards out back." "Caleb," Alice said, turning to the boy who was watching her suspiciously from the doorway, "fetch me a fresh bucket of water. Cora, find a rag. We are going to wash this table before we eat." The twins stared at her in shock. Clearly they had been running wild with zero discipline. They looked at their father for salvation. Josiah leaned against the doorframe, trussing his massive arms over his chest, the hint of the smirk returning to his lips. "You heard her. Do as she says." For the next 2 hours, Alice initiated a blitzkrieg on the cabin. With the reluctant help of the twins, she cleared the table, scrubbed the heavy oak surface until it shone, swept the dirt from the floorboards, and organized the scattered hunting gear into a corner. She found a sack of flour, some cured bacon, and a jar of preserved apples in the root cellar, and managed to whip out the simple but hearty meal of biscuits, fried pork, and apple compost. When they sat down to eat, the silence was thick. The twins devoured the food ravenously, their manners non-existent. Josiah ate with the quiet focus of a man who viewed food merely as fuel, but Alice noticed him reach for a third biscuit with an appreciative grunt. After dinner, Josiah went out to tend to the animals. Alice heated water over the fire and forced the twins to wash their faces and hands before sending them up the ladder to the loft. They went grudgingly, but the exhaustion of the day's drama seemed to have quelled their rebellion for the night. Alone in the quiet cabin, Alice began to wipe down the stone mantel above the hearth. As she moved a heavy cast-iron clock to dust beneath it, a small folded piece of parchment fluttered to the floor. Alice bent down and picked it up. It was a letter, the paper crisp and expensive, bearing a wax seal that had been broken. She unfolded it, intending to place it back on the mantel, but her eyes caught the signature at the bottom. Silas Montgomery. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked at the date. It was written 3 weeks ago. She hesitated, a moral compass warring with her sudden, intense curiosity. The name Silas Montgomery had ruined her life just hours ago. Why was Josiah Coloulton receiving letters from the man he claimed to despise? She read the brief scrolled text. Coloulton, my patience is wearing thin. The timber on Whispering Ridge belongs to the Montgomery Syndicate by right of the original claim. Regardless of what that drunken judge says, you will sell the lower acreage to me by the end of the month, or I will take alternative measures. I will not allow a squatter to ruin my expansion. Remember what happened the last time you defied me. SM. Alice's breath hitched. Remember what happened the last time you defied me? The heavy cabin door swung open, the cold mountain wind sweeping inside. Josiah stood in the doorway, a load of firewood in his arms. He froze when he saw Alice standing by the hearth, the letter in her hand. The icy blue of his eyes darkened into something dangerous. He dropped the wood into the bin with a loud crash that made Alice jump. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, snatched the letter from her trembling fingers, and threw it directly into the fire. I told you I'd treat you with respect, Alice, Josiah said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried more menace than a shout. But there's one rule in this house. You do not pry into my business with Montgomery, and you never mention my wife's death. He turned and walked towards the canvas curtain that shielded his bed. Take the cot near the fire tonight. Tomorrow the real work begins. Alice stood by the hearth, watching the expensive paper curl and turn to ash in the flames. She had sought a safe haven from a cruel man, only to realize she had just bound herself to a man who was fighting a war against him, and somehow she was caught right in the middle. The first 3 weeks on Whispering Ridge were a brutal baptism by fire and frost. Alice's days began long before the sun crested the jagged eastern peaks, announced only by the biting cold that seeped through the chinking in the log walls. Her hands already calloused from the St. Louis textile mills grew split and raw from hauling icy water from the spring, chopping kindling and scrubbing cast-iron pots with river sand. Josiah Huck, as she was slowly learning to call him in the quiet moments, was a ghost of a husband. He left the cabin at dawn with his Winchester and a double-bitted axe, spending his daylight hours felling massive ponderosa pines or checking his trap lines along the high ridges. He provided meat, venison, rabbit, and once a mountain sheep, but he offered little in the way of conversation. He was a man locked inside his own fortress of grief and stubborn survival. Yet Alice noticed the small things. The firewood bin was never empty. A fresh tin of beeswax salve appeared silently on the washstand for her cracked hands, and the heavy buffalo robe always found its way over her shivering shoulders when the hearth fire died down to clear's throat to embers in the dead of night. Her most grueling battle, however, was not with the mountain but with the twins. Caleb and Cora were wild things, fiercely loyal to their father and deeply suspicious of the interloper in the faded gingham dress. They ignored her instructions, hid her sewing shears, and refused to eat anything she cooked if they could forage berries or chew on dry jerky instead. The turning point came on a Tuesday in late October, when the sky bruised a deep, ominous purple. Alice was on the porch wrestling with a stubborn churn of butter when she heard a sharp, terrified scream echo from the dense tree beyond the corral. It wasn't the playful shriek of children. It was a sound of raw panic. Dropping the churn paddle, Alice hiked up her heavy wool skirts and ran. She plunged into the pine thicket, the dry needles slick beneath her boots. "Caleb! Corora!" she screamed, her lungs burning in the thin mountain air. "Here, down here." Caleb's voice was ready with terror. Alice crashed through a stand of scrub oak and found Caleb kneeling at the edge of a steep, rocky ravine. 20 feet below, a rushing creek cut through the stone. Clinging to a fragile, twisting cedar root halfway down the sheer drop was Cora. The little girl's face was pale with terror, her boots slipping on the loose shale. Below her, the water churned over jagged granite teeth. Pa's too far down the valley, Caleb sobbed, grabbing Alice's apron. She was trying to catch a stray turkey poult. Alice didn't hesitate. She looked around frantically, spotting a thick coil of heavy hemp rope Huck used for dragging timber left near a stump. She grabbed it, tying a rapid, brutal bowline knot around a sturdy pine trunk. "Caleb, do not move from this spot," Alice commanded, her voice dropping the frantic edge and adopting the ironclad authority she used to survive the slums of St. Martin. Louis. She tied the other end of the rope around her own waist, pulling it tight. Alice lowered herself over the edge. The rocks tore at her dress and scraped her forearms, but she ignored the stinging pain. She rappelled down the cliff face, her boots searching for purchase in the crumbling shale. "I've got you, Cora," Alice gasped, reaching the ledge just as the cedar root gave an ominous crack. "Let go of the root and grab my neck." "Do it now," Cora whimpered, her blue eyes wide with distrust. "I said it," Alice barked, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. Startled by the command, the 6-year-old let go. Alice caught her, wrapping one arm tightly around the girl's waist while her other hand gripped the rope with agonizing force. The sudden weight nearly pulled Alice off the wall, her shoulders screaming in protest, but she held on foot by agonizing foot. Alice hauled them both up the incline, pulling on the rope until her palms bled. When they finally tumbled over the edge onto the soft pine needles, Caleb threw himself at his sister. Alice collapsed onto her back, gasping for the thin mountain air, her arms trembling violently. Cora sat up, wiping dirt and tears from her face. She looked at Alice, then at the blood smearing Alice's hands. The little girl reached out tentatively and touched Alice's torn sleeve. "You didn't run away," Cora whispered. "I gave your father my word," Alice wheezed, sitting up and pulling both children into a fierce, unexpected embrace. To her shock, they didn't pull away. When Huck returned at dusk, he found the cabin warm, smelling of roasted venison, and his twins sitting quietly at the table practicing their letters on a slate board. He noticed Alice's bandaged hands and the torn hem of her dress. But before he could ask, Caleb spoke up. "Alice pulled Cora out of the Devil's Drop today. She bled for it." Huck froze, his icy blue eyes locked onto Alice's across the room. The impenetrable wall he kept between them cracked just a fraction, revealing a well of terrifyingly deep gratitude. He walked over to the wash basin, but instead of washing his own hands, he gently took hers. His large, rough thumbs brushed over the makeshift linen bandages. "I owe you a life debt, Alice," he rumbled softly, his face mere inches from hers. The scent of pine, wood smoke, and sweat clung to him, intoxicating and wholly masculine. "We are partners, Huck," she whispered back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "We protect our own." The moment was shattered by the heavy thud of hooves outside. Goliath, the draft horse, let out a nervous whinny in the corral. Huck's tenderness vanished instantly. He dropped her hands, snatched his Winchester from the corner, and stepped onto the porch. Alice followed, standing in the doorway with the twins tucked behind her skirts. 3 riders sat in the clearing. They were not mounted. They wore tailored dusters and expensive sunts, their horses branded with the interlocking M of the Montgomery Syndicate. The lead rider, a man with a scarred jaw and a silver-studded gun belt, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Evening, Coloulton," the man drawled. "Get off my ridge, Bod," Huck warned, the hammer of his rifle pulling back with a sharp, lethal click. Bod smirked, pulling a folded legal document from his coat. "Not your ridge much longer, Mr. Montgomery has secured a contract with General William Jackson Palmer himself to supply railroad ties for the Denver and Rio Grande expansion. The territorial governor just granted the syndicate right of way through this entire valley, including your illegal squatter's claim." Clear as throat, Bodie tossed the paper. It fluttered to the dirt at the bottom of the porch steps. "You have 2 weeks to vacate, Coloulton, or the syndicate will send men to clear the timber and the trash off this mountain." Bodie tipped his hat, his eyes lingering leerously on Alice. "Shame to see a pretty little thing like you get caught in a brush fire. Mom, Montgomery sends his regards." As the riders wheeled their horses and galloped back down the trail, Huck stared after them, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Alice looked down at the eviction notice in the dirt. The war Silas Montgomery had started at the train station had finally followed her up the mountain. Winter did not arrive on Whispering Ridge. It assaulted it. By the second week of November, a blizzard swept down from the high peaks, burying the cabin in 3 feet of snow and dropping the temperature to a bone-cracking 30 below zero. The world shrank to the size of the single main room. The isolation was absolute. With the trails impossible, Huck was forced indoors, spending hours mending harnesses and sharpening tools by the fire, his massive frame dominating the small space. The physical proximity between him and Alice became a living, breathing entity. Every accidental brush of their shoulders, every shared glance over the twins' heads was charged with a heavy, simmering tension. Alice found herself watching the play of muscles beneath his flannel shirt, while Huck's gaze lingered on the soft curve of her neck as she read by the firelight. But the romantic tension was violently derailed on the 4th day of the storm when Caleb woke up screaming. Alice rushed up the loft ladder. The boy was thrashing in his blankets, his skin burning with a terrifying dry heat. His breathing was shallow and ragged, his lips tinged blue. "Huck!" Alice shouted, her voice laced with panic. Huck practically tore the ladder from its hinges getting up to the loft. When he saw his son, all the color drained from his weathered face. He fell to his knees, his large hands hovering helplessly over the boy. "No!" he chirped out, a sound of absolute, unadulterated terror. No, not the fever, not again. Alice instantly realized what she was seeing. It wasn't just a childhood sickness. It was the ghost of the tragedy that had broken this family. This was the same winter fever that had killed Sarah. "Fetch snow," Alice ordered, pushing past Huck's paralysis. "We need to bring his temperature down now." "Huck, move!" Her sharp command snapped him out of his terror. He scrambled down the ladder and out the door into the howling blizzard. For the next 48 hours, the cabin became a battlefield. Alice worked tirelessly, drawing on every scrap of knowledge she had from nursing her own family through the cholera outbreaks in St. Mans. Louis. She packed Caleb in snow-chilled rags, forced willow bark tea down his throat, and kept the fire roaring to sweat the sickness out. Huck paced the floor like a caged bear. He refused to sleep, refusing to eat. When Alice finally managed to get Caleb to fall into a peaceful, unbroken sweat, signaling the fever had broken, she collapsed against the stone hearth, exhausted beyond measure. Huck slumped to the floor beside her. He buried his face in his large, scarred hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, dry sobs. The mountain man, the stoic giant of Whispering Ridge, was completely undone. Alice hesitantly reached out, placing a gentle hand on his broad shoulder. "He's going to be fine, Huck. The fever broke. He's sleeping." Huck looked up, his icy eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "Sarah didn't make it to the sweat. She just burned away, and I couldn't stop it." Alice's heart ached for him, Claire's throat. "You cannot blame yourself for a sickness. The frontier is cruel." Huck let out a bitter, jagged laugh. "It wasn't just the frontier, Alice. It was him." Alice frowned, confusion clouding her exhaustion. "Who?" "Silas Montgomery." Huck spat the name like a curse. He leaned back against the rough logs, staring into the flames. 2 years ago, Silas wanted this ridge. I refused to sell. When winter hit, the fever swept through the valley. Sarah caught it first. I rode down to Bitter Creek for the doctor and for quinine. Huck's jaw clenched so tight Alice thought his teeth might shatter. Silas had bought out the toll road at the bottom of the gorge. He posted armed men at the barricade. They knew I was coming. They knew my wife was dying. They told me I could pass if I signed the deed over right there in the snow. I fought them, put 2 of them in the ground, but they shot my horse out from under me. By the time I hiked back up this mountain on foot with the medicine, it was too late. I buried her the next morning. The breath was knocked from Alice's lungs. The cruelty was unfathomable. Silas hadn't just rejected her at the station. He was a monster who had practically murdered this man's wife to steal timber. "He thinks he can do it again," Huck whispered, turning to look at Alice. "He thinks he can freeze me out, starve me out, or scare me out. He sent you away because you weren't a pretty little ornament for his Denver mansion, and now he wants to burn the only home you have left." Alice felt a profound, blazing anger ignite in her chest. It burned away the lingering shame of her rejection at the train station. It burned away her fear of the mountain. She looked at this broken, magnificent man beside her, and she knew with absolute certainty that she belonged here. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was going to war for her family. "He will not take this mountain, Josiah," Alice said, her voice a low, fierce vow. She used his given name, claiming him. And he will not take us. Huck stared at her, mesmerized by the fire in her eyes. The faint white scar on her cheek seemed to glow in the hearthlight, a badge of survival rather than a flaw. He reached up, his rough fingers tracing the line of the scar with a reverence that made Alice tremble. "You are the strongest thing I have ever seen," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned in and Alice met him halfway. Their first kiss was not a gentle romantic flutter. It was a desperate collision of grief, survival, and profound undeniable need. He tasted of black coffee and desperation, his hands tangling in her loose hair as he pulled her against his chest. Alice wrapped her arms around his neck, anchoring herself to him, sealing the silent pact between them. They were no longer a business arrangement. They were husband and wife, bound by blood, snow, and a shared enemy. By late February, the brutal grip of winter began to loosen. The snowdrifts receded, turning the mountain trails into treacherous, muddy sloughs. With the thaw came the frantic need to prepare for the spring logging season. The legal deadline Bod had delivered had long passed, ignored by Huck. But the silence from the valley was far more terrifying than any threat. "I have to check the lower timber lines," Huck announced one crisp Tuesday morning, strapping his heavy gun belt around his waist. "Sill's men might try to dam the creek to flood our logging road before the spring melt." Alice stood by the stove, wrapping a thick wedge of cornbread in a cloth for his pack. She tried to mask her anxiety, but her hands betrayed her with a slight tremor. "How long will you be gone?" "Just till nightfall," Huck promised, stepping close and pressing a firm, reassuring kiss to her forehead. The physical affection between them had blossomed since the night of the blizzard, the quiet, steady flame that kept the cabin warm. He walked over to the mantel and took down a sleek live-action Winchester rifle. He loaded it with practiced ease and handed it to Alice. "Keep the door barred. If anyone rides up that ain't me, you don't ask questions. You fire a warning shot into the dirt. If they don't turn around, you aim for the chest." Alice took the heavy weapon, feeling the cold steel against her palms. "I understand." Huck mounted Goliath and rode down the muddy trail, disappearing into the dense pine shadows. Alice barred the heavy oak door behind him, an uneasy knot tightening in her stomach. She kept the twins busy with their lessons, refusing to let them play outside. The attack didn't come with a grand dialysis. It came with the smell of smoke. It was mid-afternoon. Alice was darning a sock when Caleb suddenly sneezed. "Alice, something's burning." Alice dropped the needle and rushed to the window, rubbing the grime from the glass. The blood ran cold. Down by the tree, 50 yards from the cabin, 3 men were dismounting. It was Bod and 2 other syndicate thugs. They weren't riding up to talk. One of them was holding a torch made of oil-soaked rags, actively setting fire to the dry brush stacked against the side of the newly built timber shed. The shed holding all of Huck's winter furs and logging equipment. Silas had realized that a legal eviction would take too long to enforce through the corrupt courts in Denver. It was going to smoke them out, burn their livelihood, and force them to flee or starve. "Caleb Correr, get under the bed," Alice ordered, her voice eerily calm. "Do not come out until I say so." She didn't wait for them to argue. She grabbed the Winchester, threw the heavy iron bar off the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold wind whipped her hair around her face. "Hey!" Alice screamed, raising the rifle to her shoulder and nestling the stock against her cheek, just as her father had taught her in the Missouri woods before the collar took him. The 3 men jerked in surprise. Body dropped the torch, his hand flying to his revolver. He laughed when he saw the lone woman in a gingham dress standing on the porch. "Well, look here, boys," Bod sneered, stepping out from behind the shed. "The ugly little bride wants to play. Put the gun down, sweetheart. We're just here to clear some brush for Mr. Tarn." "Montgomery." Alice didn't speak. She adjusted her aim, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared, kicking hard against her shoulder. A cloud of black powder smoke engulfed the porch. The bullet slammed into the dirt exactly 1 in from the toe of Bod's expensive leather boot, showering his leg with gravel and mud. Bod yelled, leaping backward, his face draining of color. The other 2 men scrambled for cover behind their horses. "The next one goes through your knee, Bod," Alice shouted, chambering another round with a sharp metallic clack. "Get off my land, you crazy bitch," Bodie snarled, drawing his revolver and firing blindly towards the cabin. The bullet splintered the wooden post 3/4 to Alice's left. Alice didn't flinch. She tracked the man who had the torch. He was trying to slink around the back of the shed to throw it onto the cabin's shingled roof. She fired again. The shot hit the wooden bucket hanging off the man's saddle, blowing it to pieces and spooking his horse, which reared and bolted down the trail, dragging the man through the mud. Inside the cabin, Caleb peeked out from under the bed. Seeing Alice holding her ground against 3 armed men, a fierce pride swelled in the boy's chest. He scrambled out, grabbed his father's heavy hunting knife from the table, and ran to the door, standing defensively behind Alice's skirts. "I'm with you, Ma," Caleb yelled, his small voice cracking but defiant. Alice's heart swelled at the word Ma, but she didn't take her eyes off the threat. Buddy, realizing he was losing the psychological battle to a woman and a child, and terrified of the spooked horses, fired one last wild shot that shattered the cabin window. "Nonty will send 50 men next time," he screamed, scrambling onto his horse. "You're dead. You hear me?" He spurred his horse and galloped down the trail after his fleeing companions, leaving the burning brush pile behind. Alice immediately dropped the rifle and sprinted toward the shed, Caleb right on her heels. They grabbed the snow shovels leaning against the barn and desperately began throwing muddy slush onto the flames. The fire hissed and sputtered, fighting them for every inch, but the wet spring ground was on their side. Within 10 minutes they had smothered the blaze, saving the shed and the precious tools inside. Alice collapsed into the mud, her dress ruined, her face smeared with black soot, her chest heaving. Caleb dropped to his knees beside her, his chest heaving too. He looked at her, his blue eyes wide with awe. "You shot at him," the boy breathed reverently. "I told you," Alice gasped, wiping sweat from her forehead. "We protect our own." A sound like thunder echoed up the trail. Alice panicked, thinking Bud had returned, but then she saw the massive black form of Goliath cresting the ridge. Huck was riding hard, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He had heard the gunshots echoing down the gorge. He threw himself off the horse before it even stopped, his rifle drawn, his eyes scanning the clearing for bodies. When he saw the scorched earth, the smoldering brush, and Alice sitting in the mud with Caleb, he dropped his weapon and ran to them. He fell to his knees in the mud, pulling Alice and Caleb into a desperate, crushing embrace. Cora came running from the cabin, tears streaming down her face, and threw her arms around Huck's neck. "I heard the shots," Huck choked out, his large hands frantically checking Alice for bullet wounds. "God, Alice, I thought he took you from me." "I am fine," Alice said fiercely, gripping his face in her soot-stained hands. "I held them off, but they tried to burn us out." Josiah's body was here. Huck's expression shifted. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, terrifying wrath. He looked down the muddy trail where the syndicate men had fled. The mountain man who had tried to just survive, who had tried to avoid a war, was dead. "Silas Montgomery crossed the line," Huck said, his voice dropping into a deadly, growly whisper that made the hair on Alice's arms stand up. He stood up, pulling Alice to her feet. "He sent his dogs to my home. Now I'm bringing the mountain down on him." The descent into Bitter Creek was not a retreat. It was a war party. Huck rode Goliath, his Winchester resting across his saddle horn, his face carved from the same unforgiving granite as the peaks behind them. Alice sat beside him in the wagon, her ruined gingham dress replaced by a sturdy wool-riding habit she had fashioned from Sarah's old trunk. In her lap rested her tattered carpet-bag. Inside it were not just her meager belongings, but the bundle of letters Silas Montgomery had written to her during their 8-month courtship. Letters filled with arrogant boasts that she now realized were a weapon. Bitter Creek was bustling with the arrival of the afternoon stagecoach. Silas Montgomery stood on the boardwalk outside the Alhambra saloon, a cigar clamped between his teeth, shaking hands with Major John Wesley, the purchasing agent for General William Jackson Palmer's railroad. Body stood nearby, his leg bandaged from Alice's warning shot. When Huck's wagon rattled to a halt in the muddy street, the town square went dead silent. Huck stepped down from Goliath. He didn't draw his rifle, but the sheer radiating menace of his massive frame made 3 cowboys step off the boardwalk to get out of his way. "Coloulton," Silas sneered, though his eyes darted nervously to the sheriff standing down the street. "I see you finally decided to vacate my timber claim, and you brought the scarred stray with you." "I ain't here to vacate, Montgomery," Huck rumbled, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "I'm here to collect a blood debt. You sent your dogs to burn my home with my children inside." Todd's hand twitched toward his holster. Huck didn't even look at him. With lightning speed, his hand shot to his belt, and the heavy hunting knife flew through the air, embedding itself deep into the wooden post, directly between Bod's fingers. Body yelped and fell back. "Sheriff," Silas barked, his face flushing red. "Arrest this wild animal. He's threatening a prominent businessman." "You aren't a businessman, Silas," Alice said, her voice ringing out clear and steady as she climbed down from the wagon. She walked right up to the boardwalk, ignoring the gasps of the townspeople. She pulled the bundle of letters from her bag. "You're a fraud and a thief." Silas laughed nervously, looking at Major Wesley. "Do not listen to this hysterical spinster, Major. She is a rejected mail-order bride seeking revenge." "I am Alice Coloulton," she corrected fiercely, standing shoulder to shoulder with Huck. She turned to the railroad agent. "Major Wesley, my husband's claim on Whispering Ridge is entirely legal. Mr. Montgomery has been telling you he has the territorial rights. But I have letters here written by Silas' own hand, boasting to his future bride about how he bribed Surveyor Thaddeus Sterling and Judge Amos Tucker to alter the valley borders on the county maps." Silas's face drained of all color. He had forgotten his own arrogance. In his desperate need to impress the woman he thought was a delicate high society beauty, he had bragged on paper about his ruthless business acumen and his pocketed officials. Major Wesley's expression hardened. He took the letters from Alice, his eyes scanning the elegant, damning handwriting. "Is this true, Montgomery? You forged the right-of-way documents." "It's a lie," Silas stammered, stepping back. "She forged them. The ink matches the contract you just signed," Major Wesley said coldly, folding the letters. "General Palmer does not do business with swindlers. The tie contract is void, and I will be handing these letters over to the federal marshal in Denver. I suggest you pack your bags, Montgomery." Silas let out a primal scream of rage. His empire was crumbling in seconds. Blinded by fury, he lunged off the boardwalk straight for Alice, his hands outstretched for her throat. He never made it. Huck intercepted him midair, a massive hand closing around Silas's tailored collar. With a singular, brutal motion, the mountain man slammed Silas into the muddy street. Silas gasped, staring up into the icy, murderous blue eyes of Josiah Coloulton. Huck drew back a fist the size of a ham-hock, ready to cave the man's face in. "Huck." "No," Alice said softly, placing her small, calloused hand on his thick forearm. "He's ruined. He isn't worth the blood on your hands. Let the law bury him." Huck breathed heavily, his knuckles white. Slowly, the killing rage faded from his eyes, replaced by a profound, anchoring love. As he looked up at his wife, he released Silas, letting the broken man gravel in the mud, and stood up. "Let's go home, Mrs. Coloulton," Huck said, offering her his arm. The story of Alice and Josiah Coloulton became a quiet legend whispered among the pines of the Colorado Territory. It was a testament to the raw, unpredictable nature of the frontier, where the greatest treasures were rarely pulled from silver mines but forged in the fires of adversity. Alice Abernathy stepped off a train seeking a fabricated fairy tale, but she found something vastly more enduring. A hard-won partnership with a man whose heart was as deep and fiercely protective as the mountains he roamed. Through blinding blizzards, ruthless greed, and the healing of two orphaned hearts, they built a fortress of love on Whispering Ridge. Silas Montgomery's empire dissolved into dust, the fitting end for a man who valued appearance over substance. Ultimately, it wasn't the delicate flower that tamed the wild frontier, but the scarred, resilient woman who knew that true salvation wasn't found in avoiding the storm, but in standing together to face